How's it going, everyone? This is International Master Daniel Wrench. This is Chess.com, and this is part 2 of the Beyond the Basics installment in the Patterns Everyone Must Know video series. This is the 4th video total, but again, this is part 2 in Beyond the Basics. At the end of Beyond the Basics, we had just finished with the decoy sacrifice, ending with pretty tricky problem. That was last Friday, one that was rather advanced, involved lots of different decoy sacrifices, and so today we're going to get started with the next one on the list, which is deflection. As you can see here, the list in front of you, the next one after decoy is deflection, and so let's jump right in. Moving on to deflection, I want to start with a really basic one. We'd like to get our queen to f6 to checkmate him on the dark squares, but the black queen is guarding it. How can we deflect it away? Pause your videos if you haven't. Ding, ding, ding. Rook to d7. Queen takes d7, queen to f6, followed by checkmate on the dark squares. You should notice that if you're having trouble considering all the different sacrifices and the complex ideas, remember that you have a luxury in all of these positions of knowing there must be something, otherwise I wouldn't have set up the position, right? You don't have that luxury in real games, but hopefully the idea about real games is that eventually you know the patterns so well that you don't need somebody tapping your shoulder telling you, hey, there's something in this position, right? Because you've learned the patterns so well. So while you're learning the patterns well, until you get to that point where you don't need reminders, I would give you this piece of advice. It's easier to consider sacrifices whenever there's the king involved. Whenever there's the highest stakes available, which what are the highest stakes of a chess game? Checkmate. Like if you recognize the potential idea of a checkmate, even if it's not possible to play at this point, the fact that you recognize the potential idea for something that involves the highest stakes is kind of like a get-out-of-jail-free card to consider sacrifices. I wouldn't normally suggest you go around sacking your queens and rooks and all kinds of business, right? But in this situation, if there's something of the highest stakes available, you almost have to consider it. It's your obligation to consider every possible deflection or any kind of tactic. This move leaves the queen with no other options but to take the rook or lose herself, and in the end, she wishes that she hadn't. So again, if you're struggling considering advanced moves or complex moves or even just sacrifices in general, if you're someone who struggles considering those moves, push yourself to know that if there are ever checkmate ideas possible, it's like a get-out-of-jail-free card. You should be allowed to consider those ideas because, hey, any metamaterial is worth checkmate, right? So that's a little practical piece of advice for you that I hope helps. Next problem. This, you see, is a very famous deflection mating net. White to play. If you haven't paused your clock, go ahead. Queen to a7 check, deflecting the king away from the purpose of guarding the 7th rank. And after king takes a7, rook takes c7, knight takes b6 is checkmate. Noted that the other way around is possible, but doesn't lead to anything clear, just a bunch of checks and silly business. So the deflection idea of taking the king away from guarding c7 should be considered. And again, all sacrifices should be considered whenever the highest stakes are involved. Quickly, here's one other basic deflection that leads to a mating pattern that's very well known. You sacrifice the queen on f7, deflecting the knight away from e6, but you could also argue this is a decoy because this next move, knight e6 check, would not be checkmate unless the knight had been decoyed to f7, right? So it's a decoy deflection. You deflect the knight away from guarding this square and decoy it to this square, thus self-mating the king, allowing you to play knight e6 check. Pretty sweet, right? Now, overloading tactics are great, our next theme, because so many positions I feel like are overloading tactics when you're just taking advantage of your opponent's overwhelming responsibilities that he may have given to one or two pieces, or like not cleared a back rank weakness, right? Anytime you see weaknesses that involve like the highest nature of things like back ranks, always look for overloading tactics, because if one piece alone is committed to guarding something as valuable as the back rank, usually there's a way to try to deflect them away. So this could be considered a deflection or an overloading tactic, and I love it because it's very similar to the Venus flytrap one we just saw, except now it's black to play and win. Queen to d5, exclamaviach, attacking both the queen and the knight, so we're also, of course, seeing a double attack. Again, these patterns are just crazy repeating, aren't they? And we're deflecting the queen away from the threat of back rank checkmate, so it's also a deflection. But the main point is that it's overloading, because the queen has to move, and it's overloaded between the back rank responsibility and guarding the knight. We've taken advantage of it, but that awesome double attack deflection, and we win the knight on g5 because the queen on d1 was overloaded of responsibilities. In this great overload tactic, we're basically full of potential when we see all these pieces attacking over on this side of the board, but none of the moves are totally clear. If you just take f6 right away and the black queen takes back, you've just made a big trade because his rook on a6 is also defending the queen, right? So taking f6 simply doesn't do anything. So rather than just making trades, you try to see all these pins and back rank weaknesses and all this potential dynamism, right? Dynamism, I never say that word, I get tongue-tied, as a means to consider more tactics, right? That's the thing about doing all these positions is you're starting to see that weaknesses that exist in your opponent's position, there's got to be some potential for some kind of tactic, right? And so that's why getting yourself familiar with all your different options, all the different patterns that you should know, will make you much better at just, putting people away. Knight e7 check. You start with a fork double attack that forces rook takes e7 and completely exposes the back rank. And after queen takes f6, we see another double attack on g7 and c6. And rook to d8. Why do I consider this an overload tactic? Basically because of this position here, where we see so many pieces hanging, and the queen with the responsibilities of guarding the back rank and the threats along the sixth rank were simply too much. So it was a clearance sacrifice at the d file, it was a double attack, it was a fork, it was also an overloading tactic. Finally, let's take a look at one of my favorite overloading tactics because it involves seeing the potential for an overload. It doesn't exist right now, but it's there. The queen is guarding this bishop, the queen is guarding checkmate, and the queen is also on the same line with the rook, which just always makes you want to look for tactical possibilities. The winning move here for black, if you haven't paused your video, go ahead, is the move rook takes d4. The queen, of course, can't capture because of checkmate, and after c takes d4, the winning follow-up is bishop to g4, applying a double attack. It's not a skewer because you're interposed, right? So it's not necessarily a skewer, it's just a double attack of the queen and the rook. And as much as this queen would love to capture off this bishop, he can't because of checkmate. So we see this overload in action one more time. Too many things to guard. Moving on to removal of the defender, let's start with a big-time problem. White to play and win, and there's lots of defenders that need to be removed for this guy to get the other side of the board, so hopefully you see it. We chop Alicious, and after black has to take back, we chop Alicious and push. This is one of those just like, crazy blowing open positions too. I think there's a name for that kind of tactic, like just destruction. But in any case, the idea is that the queen has to be removed before you could take on c8, so we remove the defender here. The knight has to be removed before you can advance the pawn. So though this is a very tricky one, involved lots of sacrifices, even for advanced players it was probably tough. We see that it was a multiple defenders removed, and a good one to know. There is perhaps no more obvious example of removal of the defender or a deflection tactic where the kind of position where they're basically brothers than this one here. We'd like to trade queens, but not really. We'd really like to win that queen. Well, the problem with that is the rook's guarding it. Well, okay, why don't we just go remove it? Taking advantage of the fact that the king is on the back rank, we deflect this rook away from the queen, we remove the defender, and then we win the queen outright. Let's look at that again in slow-mo, instant replay. Slow-mo, Sports Center, instant replay, white wins the game. Lastly, let's take a look at a fun positional removal of the defender. This is such a great square for your knight, and you'd love to hop that pony in there. Problem is, he'd just be traded at this point. So, when you recognize a huge positional weakness, go remove that defender if you can, and then pop your piece into that square. This is not the most common example of a removal of the defender tactic, but it is one in my eyes because you recognize a huge weakness and you simply remove the defender to execute the idea. One thing that should be noted, this is a game by Bobby Fischer, and in this position, if you were tempted to take the bishop and go win this pawn, then you were dead wrong because you missed the skewer of your queen to the rook based on the back rank tactic, right? That would have been sweet. Not for you, for your opponent, obviously. So the winning idea, of course, would just be to keep this dominant knight versus a horrible bishop, bring your pieces over, and go checkmate the black king. A great example of a positional removal of the defender, popping into that square. We love it. Now moving on to interference tactics. I will say that an interference tactic really involves the awareness of, let's say, the bad coordination or just the awkwardness of your opponent's pieces. When you start to think about things like a potential back rank weakness, and you start to take into account the position of all of your opponent's pieces, you allow yourself to consider moves that are obviously a little bit tricky and not the norm, right? I was talking about this sort of whenever you see like a potential checkmate idea that's a get-out-of-jail-free card, to consider every sacrifice, right? And I think that's good practical advice you can take into your games. That way you don't have to become a crazy person who's sacking all the time, but you understand that those types of moves do exist when there's bigger weaknesses. Well, an interference tactic definitely falls under that category, where if you're aware of the awkwardness potential of your opponent's pieces and potential weaknesses, you can consider moves that seem a little bit funky. In this position, for example, white's best move, if you haven't paused your video, you can go ahead, is bishop to e6, exclamaviach, placing the bishop right in between a number of black's pieces and actually simply offering it up for capture. But the idea is pretty simple. If black captures with the pawn, this rook is hanging here, as the bishop no longer guards it. If black captures with the bishop, the rook is still hanging here, and so... and actually, excuse me, it's not that the rook is hanging, but rather by playing this interference move, you've also opened up the d file, so now the move queen to c8 check, followed by either piece blocking on d8 for black. Here we would see an x-ray tactic once again. And after takes, we see checkmate. So this move, bishop e6, this guerrilla tactic, as I like to call it, this interference in between all of these different pieces, not only creates the controversy and the threat of just winning the rook on d7, but also opens up the d file for potential back rank checkmate threats. And of course, if you take the rook on d3, the undefended rook, queen to e8 is checkmate. Moving on, our next interference tactic is a very common one. Wasn't even sure if this officially fell into the category of interference, but in my mind it does. When you have a specific goal, a specific target, or let's say advantage you're trying to convert, this type of idea of interposing a line, whether it's a rank, a file, or diagonal with a piece, as a temporary means to open up another piece, allows for tactics. You actually see this idea particularly when it comes to promotion tricks, where you're trying to promote a pawn. Pushing it right away likely would not be good enough here, as after the move a3, black does get closer to getting a queen, and so in many of these cases, white has even better than just queening the pawn, but rather just to sacrifice the knight, cutting off the line, and after rook takes c8, playing the move rook to d8. So the knight went to e8, interfering with the rook's protection of the c8 square, and after rook to d8, there's no way to stop white from promoting this pawn and getting a full queen without even giving black the option to sacrifice back. Finally, from the black side, we see a pretty famous interference idea, and rather tricky one even for advanced players. And it has to do, again, with looking at all the awkwardness of your opponent's pieces and the potential threats and diagonals and squares that you control. And you kind of just have to put all the pieces together. You have to be willing to consider different options whenever you see there's awkward things going on. In this position, black has the brilliant move rook to e1. A very strong move that takes advantage of the fact that if rook takes e1, knight f2 check wins the queen. So I guess we could call that a removal of the defender idea if we're trying to apply this fork. But the obvious case is that white will probably not take with the rook, as it seems a lot better to take with either the knight or the bishop. But either one of these moves will also lose the game to this nice move, knight to b2. Unleashing the queen, threatening checkmate on f1, which, by the way, only works because the queen on d1 is now cut off. Again, to see that in action, we sacrifice the rook in order to cut off the queen's protection of the rook, and after white captures the move knight to b2, unleashing the queen to attack the f1 square, and in this case, threaten checkmate. White will simply be losing the queen here, as taking the knight on b2 would be even worse. A pretty good example, pretty tricky example of interference. If anybody solved that one for black, you get kudos. And after bishop takes or knight takes, we see this discovery idea. Again, more tactics just intertwining with each other, and black is winning the game. Moving on to a tactic we foreshadowed in the last set of problems with interference. Here we see the idea of an X-ray in full force. If you'd like to take a moment to pause the clock and guess what white does here, you can do so. The move here is the move queen to b4. Exclamaviach, with the immediate threat and idea obviously being a double attack of the two rooks. Of course, the queen is not capturable by the rook because the back rank is an issue. So black plays the only move here, a very tricky move, rook to d8. And we see multiple threats on both players' back ranks, right? Taking d8 would be fine, but after queen takes d8, you can't take the rook because of the threat of checkmate, so that doesn't get us anywhere. So what else can white do here? White plays the move rook to d5, based on an X-ray tactic. The whole point is that black cannot capture on d5 due to queen to b8 check, and after the queen blocks, queen takes d8, and we see the X-ray tactic in full force, with black ending the game with a back rank checkmate. So rook to d5 renews the double attack of the two rooks, now using two pieces, and black has one final X-ray defensive tactic. If you want to pause the clock to see it, you can. That's the move rook to d3. So now we see multiple x-rays going. Neither side really wants to capture with the rook that's on the back rank because of their opponent's potential x-ray ideas. Unfortunately for black, it's white's choice here, and white can capture with the rook on the 5th rank, renewing the idea of the x-ray tactic and ending the game with checkmating black on the back rank. This position, as much as anything, I believe, really highlights an x-ray idea because we see multiple versions of the x-ray. I mean, if this doesn't show you an x-ray of pieces attacking each other and threading things through the opponent's pieces, then nothing will. So again, you see that white couldn't caption here because of black's threat of an x-ray. Pretty cool, right? And again, if black captures this way in the game, then he'll end up running into his own x-ray difficulty. So after queen to b4, the final conclusion of the position is that white is actually winning after rook to d5, and even after rook d3, rook 5 takes d3, black resigned. I wanted to show an example of a defensive x-ray, just to show you that you can also defend through your opponent's pieces. For example, in this game, white is not threatening to play the move queen to d8 check, not because of rook takes, which would actually eventually lose to a back rank checkmate, but rather the immediate queen f8, where we see black's pieces defend each other through the enemy queen on d8. Very interesting, right? So in this position, after the move rook to e3, black can simply capture the pawn on f2 with the rook, and he still maintains the defense of the back rank. Rook takes f3 would run into rook takes d2, and after a big trade, black would go on to win this endgame. So you should notice that because you need to keep this defensive x-ray idea in mind, rook e3, queen takes f2 would be a big blunder after the move rook to e2, double exclam, skewering the queen to the rook based on the fact that queen takes e2, winning a free rook, simply doesn't work because of the back rank checkmate. So this is kind of a tricky one that if you're aware of your defensive needs here to keep an eye on the defensive x-ray you have available, you would take with the rook and keep the pressure on the f8 square, preparing to trade queens if need be, and not take with the queen, allowing your opponent a skewer on your undefended rook on g2. Very interesting stuff. Our last x-ray is not officially an x-ray in the literal sense that pieces directly attack or defend each other through another piece, but rather an x-ray of attack for yourself based on a potential threat or target. In this position, white plays the move queen to a3 check based on the fact that king to g8 loses immediately to bishop takes h7, followed by taking the queen. So in the game, black plays queen to e7, but here we see the idea of an x-ray based on we're attacking through the enemy pieces. And of course, a pin is also involved here with the move bishop to c6, exclam. The idea is pretty simple. He can't take the rook on e1 because that's Chekarolina Lashamba. And if he takes the queen on a3, we see the x-ray. The idea was that our rook and bishop are actually ganging up on the threat of e8 through the enemy piece. So not an official x-ray, but in my mind, I don't know exactly what that type of discovered attack is called, other than a discovered attack combined with an x-ray threat. In my eyes, that's exactly what we would refer to this type of tactic as. Let's go ahead and move on to the clearance sacrifice. The most common type of clearance sacrifices were given in the first introduction to the basics example, and so those ones are definitely the most common, and again, they happen in the definitions and examples article. But there's a few other clearance sacrifices I thought I'd bring to your attention. Here we see a defensive clearance sacrifice where white's only way to draw against the onslaught of black pawns is to actually sacrifice this pawn on c5 with tempo on the bishop, and after black captures it, he's opened this critical diagonal to attack the e6 pawn and now blockade on the light squares. Believe it or not, you can take a look and pause the video for a while if you want, but this is a theoretical draw with white having completely blockaded the light squares. Basic opposite code bishop principles. A move like coming around this way would simply be too slow to try to do the same thing, as black king gets here just in time to avoid the blockade. So again, white makes a sacrifice of the pawn to clear this diagonal, a clearance sacrifice for defensive purposes, and then immediately blockades on the light squares and goes on to draw this endgame here. The next clearance sacrifice that isn't as common as the ones given in the first video in definitions and examples articles, again, you can check those out, is one where you're clearing just a literal square. In this position, white is threatening checkmate on h7, and as well as g7, and the position pretty much seems to be falling apart for black. Not much it looks like black can do besides resign, but there is one final brilliant resource that involves clearing a square for this knight on g4 and getting rid of white's piece that's pinning the pawn on h7. That move is queen to e1 check, exclam. The rook has to take it, obviously, and after knight f2 check and taking this rook with check, all checks you'll notice, Black actually goes into an endgame where he's the one winning, easily winning up the exchange. So notice the start of the position seemed like doom for Black, but Black sacrifices this queen to free the f2 square for the knight, and then follows that with a 4 series of moves that actually wins this queen on g6. So the clearance sacrifice was involved when Black sacrificed this piece to clear a square. You can find clearance sacrifices in your own games by sometimes using imaginary chess. You're like, gosh, if I could put a piece anywhere, what would I do? And what kind of tactics would I like to have here? It's good to let yourself think about the different weaknesses in your opponent's position by kind of having an imagination about what tactics you'd like to achieve. Maybe sometimes you become aware of an idea that you didn't already know was there, right? This is imagination, Holmes. Let's move on to the next one. Our final idea of a clearance sacrifice will be one that we've seen before, and one of opening up files or diagonals. Here we see the move bishop to c7, clearing up the file for the rook to attack the eh square, and regardless of how Black captures on c7, we're coming down with the rook and eventually queening this pawn. Obviously, queen takes would probably allow us to queen the pawn immediately, but rook takes, we see the purpose of sacrificing that bishop in terms of opening the rook on e3 with tempo. That's the key, right? Basic clearance moves that don't make threats wouldn't work here. Like moving the bishop here would allow him to just go pick up this pawn. So the idea of sacrificing this bishop to clear the rook with tempo is really key. It also cuts off the rook and queen's protection of the d7 pawn, which enables us to execute the tactic. Of course, there are so many different types of desperado and switch and zug tactics. We've already talked about a couple of switch and zug or desperado type moves that have been played in some of the other tactics here. This position has a very famous type of desperado idea for Black. Here, the rook is already attacking the queen is already attacking the rook, so not a position where maybe there's pieces hanging right now for both sides, but it is one where there is the potential for that. Rather than taking f5, allowing this rook to be taken and headed to an endgame where White's actually probably a little bit better due to Black's open king. Black has a brilliant desperado move here. Rook to b3, double exclam, creating a position where just about everybody and their cousin is capturable in multiple different ways, right? It's just insane. But we look at the position and take stock, and we realize that White is completely lost. We're threatening to take b1, which is a back-rank checkmate, so taking the queen with either this piece or this piece is not possible. However, the other thing that rook to b3 did was unleash a discovered attack of Black's queen onto White's queen. So taking the rook in any one of these ways would also lose due to this idea here. So what exactly can Black do on rook to b3? The answer is pretty much nothing. In the game, Black played queen to d1 to unleash the queen from the threat of loss and defend the rook on b1. But after captures with tempo and then winning the rook on f5, we went from a possible even trade by taking here to winning an entire rook from Black's perspective. So again, rook to b3, a very brilliant desperado move that takes advantage of multiple different undefended pieces in White's camp. I have to encourage you to see the desperado and switch and zug examples we left in the definitions and examples article again, if you haven't already, to see a couple others. There's a positional desperado move, the one with bishop to a6 exclam. Go check it out. You'll see what I'm talking about. That I think is a really good example of a desperado move to find. Not going to cover that one here. But instead I'm going to end with a defensive desperado, which is always fun to see when you're in trouble and you find that the only recourse is a very, very desperate move and a brilliant desperate move. The move here played by White was queen to f6, a very, very strong move that threatens checkmate on g7, and the queen, of course, is incapturable on f6 because the rook comes down to e8 checkmate. The more you look at it, it seems like Black has just lost. The other threat is even queen to g7 check, and after the bishop takes it, rook down to e8 check, bishop f8, rook takes f8 mate. Really, really difficult to see how Black can deal with this, but there's a desperado, brilliant defensive idea. Queen to c1, double exclam. Literally putting the queen on a square where it's hanging by both of White's pieces, both the rook and the bishop. But if either one of them takes it, now the possibility of taking this queen and defending the endgame just became possible. If bishop takes it, the same thing takes place. In fact, Black is actually better given the fact that he's up a pawn in this endgame. So after queen f6, queen to c1, the position is very unclear, and that's the evaluation we'll leave it with. The defensive move that pretty much saves the game for saves the game for Black and leaves it with a very tricky and unclear position. A brilliant one, a very nice idea to remember. Take a look at that. Now, we did a basic windmill in the first video showing the Morphy's mate. Not a great example of windmill, I guess, in terms of multiple checks. If you want to, again, see the most famous windmill in the history of chess, you can see the Tory game that's, again, listed in the definitions and examples article that really gets the concept down. So here what we did was to try to take it to the next level where you recognize the possibility for a windmill. Whenever you have the rook and bishop lined up on a square close to the king, the windmill tactic should definitely be something on your mind. So here again, we show a kind of more advanced example where we see the potential for a windmill, and that opens up the door for a brilliant tactic. Here, if you haven't paused the video, go ahead. White played rook takes e6, and after queen takes e6, sacrifices the queen on f8. Note that a check on e1 would allow me to simply block and head to an endgame up a piece. So black captures f8, and after rook takes g7, king to h8, we see the windmill tactic lined up. Now, the best way to do this one is to make sure you take this pawn and threaten the queen right away. Giving a check anywhere else would actually allow black to block and head into a rook ending where he's pretty much equal. So instead, we give this check. Now, if the king repeated, we could either take the queen or repeat for another move we wanted to, doing another windmill. But the best move is rook to f6, and this is the one that really highlights that this is a windmill example here, and that is the move rook takes f6. I love this move because it really shows you that when you have a windmill tactic set up, a windmill formation set up, your opponent doesn't have anything to help them in many cases. Like even a check here would allow me to move with a discovered check, right? It's always nice to defend a check with a check. They give a check and we give a discovered check, right? Nothing but fun in terms of that. Just good old-fashioned family fun for the kids. And again, let's look at it. Good old-fashioned family fun. Bam, slam. Oh, guess what, ma'am? You got nowhere to go. Next problem. I decided to use one more example that was very similar to the one I gave in the first video, though not quite. It shows the power of the Morphy's mate idea and the windmill once again. We play the move rook to g5, and after this we see the discovered threats. The rook and bishop line up on g2, and we also make a discovery of our queen attacking his queen. Sorry for that. Rook to g5. And queen takes g5 would only lose the queen, so she takes on d7. Rook takes g2. Windmill check. Back. Windmill check. Back. We can actually repeat the windmill checks if we just want to show how powerful the windmill can be when we're just checkmating our opponent. But the main point here is not just to highlight the windmill, but to show you again how a windmill can lead to a Morphy's mate. We now move the rook along the third rank, and black is delivering checkmate only after white plays all the computer moves, lasting as long as he possibly can. Good stuff. Again, I'll say that a Zugzwang idea is not necessarily defined as a tactical pattern, but because there are so many positions that fall under that category, and they often involve very forcing types of moves, because your opponent usually only has a couple different options, right, as every move has to lose, otherwise it's not officially defined as a Zugzwang. There are very specific types of positions, and some of them are really fun, so we decided to show you just a couple more here as we wrap up the Beyond the Basics Part 2 here. The move is rook to a1 exclam here. Otherwise, black, of course, is queening. And so after rook a1, king takes a1, white actually traps the black king, putting him in a position where very clearly it can be seen that if black could say pass, he wouldn't ever play this move. Or even if we took that pawn off the board, he would be thrilled because then it would be stalemate. But since he has to play this move, it loses. And after the end of this pawn race, we see that both sides promote, but black's king is in the position to be checkmated. Pretty cool, right? When you see that this whole idea literally highlights that if black could just take this pawn off the board, he wouldn't lose. But with it, he has to play the losing move, and eventually goes on to lose after we queen and checkmate. To finish, we'll go with one that isn't necessarily a tactic, but to show a famous example of Zugzwang. The king and queen versus king and rook endgame can be a very tricky one to convert. But after white plays the move king to f6 here, we've actually officially reached the Philidor position, which became famous, named after the great chess, I don't know what he was, the chess scientist, if you want to call it, the historian, the guy that basically was one of the original dudes developing chess theory and the studies of certain positions. It was named after Philidor, and this position is a Zugzwang. If it wasn't for Zugzwang, this particular endgame would be very difficult, if not impossible, to win. As if white had to move again, making some sort of random move with the queen doesn't really help black, and actually opens up the possibility for him to give checks again, because the queen is well placed right where she is. But in this particular position, after king f6, this is a famous position known as a dead loss, as every move loses. Rook to h7 is checkmate in 1. Obviously, moving the rook to any one of these squares is going to lose the rook in one move, or g5 or g4, so we don't need to look at those. Moving the rook to d7 loses the rook. Moving the rook to c7 also loses the rook. A forced series of checks shows that. Check here. If the king moves to f8, we checkmate. King moves back to this file. We give check. Only way for him to stop from losing the rook is to block. And we get checkmated. It's a forced series of moves that's well known. This rook over here loses the rook in similar fashion. Check and check should do the trick. And moving the rook all the way over here also loses the rook in similar fashion to the ideas we've already seen. Giving checks in this way. If the king moves on this file, we can already check and check. King goes back. Give a check here is good enough. If the king goes here, we checkmate. King goes back. Check here. If the rook ever blocks, we checkmate on the diagonal. This check. Eventually, we get this check, and we win. Kind of tricky, and the same sort of corresponding ideas occur on this file here. So you can check out those endgames further if you want. Just see that the same type of series of corresponding checks exists. So this is a very famous zugzwang that occurs in an endgame that is otherwise impossible to win, and it is a good one to know. Okay, and that about wraps up the part 2 here. Again, pretty long sets of positions. We ran through a ton of them and hopefully had fun along the way. And you can watch this video as many times as you need to really get yourself familiar. But that wraps up our conclusion with the first introduction to the basics in the first 2 videos, and then we did Beyond the Basics in these last 2 videos. And you should be completely familiar with those, with Danny's top 15, if you want to call it that, and what I feel are the most critical and fundamental tactical patterns you should be aware of. And of course, there are probably tens, if not hundreds, of more important examples for every one of those particular themes, but I chose ones that were my favorites, ones that I felt highlighted them in the best possible way, and ones that I felt were really important and would help you to solve other positions too, because they're sort of repeating, and that's the whole point of studying patterns, is to try to get knowledge that you can apply to more than one position. It repeats for you, so you start to really win games off of your knowledge of patterns and experience, and that's what we're trying to do with this series, in case you haven't been paying attention. So, all right, I'm pretty excited. Hope you're excited, and I'm going to see you around on chess.com.